How does a promise between a boy and his dog, a promise to always be together, end in silence and an empty RV? This is the story of how the deepest love can lead to the most heartbreaking loss, not through cruelty, but through a single, cruel twist of fate. It is a journey that will test your heart, and a story that reminds us how fragile even the most sacred bonds can be. By liking, sharing, and subscribing, you become a vital part of our mission to ensure these powerful stories of love and loyalty are never forgotten. The world of the Harris family was framed by the wide windshield of a 1980s motorhome they affectionately called Bertha. She was a loud, rumbling beast of a vehicle. But inside, she was a home filled with the scent of coffee, old books, and the faint, dusty smell of adventure. David, a man whose patience was as deep as the focus on his camera lenses, was the family's navigator and mechanic. His wife, Maria, was the storyteller. Her laptop, a permanent fixture on the small dinette table, where she wove their travels into words. And at the center of their universe was their 10-year-old son, Caleb. Caleb was a boy made of quiet curiosity and boundless wonder, with a mop of unruly brown hair and eyes that held the same observant stillness as his father's. His most constant companion, however, was Buddy. He was a 4-month-old German Shepherd puppy, a classic tumble of black and tan fur, oversized paws, and an intelligence that already shone brightly in his amber-brown eyes. For Caleb, Buddy wasn't a pet. He was a furry, 4-legged extension of his own soul. That September, their rolling home was parked in a sun-dappled clearing in the Ozark National Forest of Arkansas. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. While David and Maria worked, Caleb and Buddy explored, their laughter and playful barks echoing through the trees. It was on one such afternoon that Caleb saw it, a flicker of brilliant orange and black against the deep green of the forest. It was a Diana fritillary, a butterfly his mother had shown him in a guidebook, its wings a canvas of iridescent color. Forgetting everything else, Caleb gave chase, his heart pounding with the thrill of discovery. Buddy, ever the loyal partner, bounded along beside him. The butterfly led them on a dizzying dance, deeper and deeper into the woods, away from the familiar trail and the sound of the nearby creek. The world shrank to the boy, the dog, and the fluttering jewel of color ahead of them. When the butterfly finally spiraled up and vanished over a thicket of brush, Caleb stopped, breathing heavily, a triumphant grin on his face. And then he looked around. The path was gone. The familiar shapes of the trees around the campsite had been replaced by an anonymous wall of green. He called out, "Mom? Dad?" But his voice was swallowed by the immense indifferent silence of the forest. A knot of fear tightened in his stomach as he noticed the light. The sun was no longer high overhead. It was a fiery orange ball sinking rapidly behind the western ridge, casting long, menacing shadows across the forest floor. Back at the campsite, concern had curdled into panic. David and Maria's calls for Caleb were met with only the chirp of crickets. Armed with powerful flashlights, they plunged into the darkening woods, their hearts hammering against their ribs with every unanswered shout. The temperature was dropping fast, and the familiar, beautiful forest now felt like a vast and threatening labyrinth. Miles away, Caleb was shivering, huddled at the base of a massive oak tree. The last of the light had bled from the sky, and the darkness was absolute, filled with unfamiliar rustles and snaps. Tears streamed silently down his cold cheeks. He wasn't just lost. He felt completely and utterly alone. But he wasn't. A wet nose nudged his hand, and a warm, furry body pressed against his side. Buddy whined softly, licking the tears from his face as if to say, "I'm still here." The puppy's steady warmth was a small shield against the growing cold and the boy's overwhelming fear. Then Buddy stood up. He let out a single, sharp bark that was different from his usual playful yaps. It was a clear, piercing sound that cut through the night. He barked again and again, a relentless, desperate call into the darkness. It was that sound that saved him. David and Maria, nearly sick with worry, heard the faint barks carrying on the wind. They crashed through the undergrowth, following the sound with a renewed, frantic hope. Finally, their flashlight beams cut through a patch of ferns and landed on a small, huddled figure. It was Caleb, safe, with Buddy standing over him like a furry sentinel, still barking defiantly at the night. The reunion was a flood of relieved tears and desperate hugs. But as his parents held him, Caleb's arms were wrapped tightly around his puppy's neck. He buried his face in Buddy's soft fur, breathing in his familiar scent. He wasn't just a pet who had stayed by his side. He was a hero who had brought him back from the edge of a terrifying darkness. "I'll never leave you, Buddy!" Caleb whispered into his fur, a solemn promise made in the heart of the great, dark woods. Never, ever. The rescue in the Ozarks left a permanent mark on the Harris family. After a few more days of quiet exploration, they pointed Bertha's nose toward home, a small, unassuming house on a quiet suburban street in Missouri. This house was their anchor, the place they returned to between journeys to do laundry, restock supplies, and feel the solid ground of a normal life beneath their feet before the call of the open road became too strong to ignore. It was a modest home, and the signs of their frugal lifestyle were evident in the way David spent 2 full days under the hood of the RV, patiently coaxing the aging engine back to health, and how Maria meticulously planned their grocery budget for the next leg of their travels. For Caleb, the return home meant a small, fenced-in backyard and his own bed. But the geography of his world had changed. Its center was no longer the house or the RV. It was Buddy. The bond forged in the cold, dark woods had deepened into something primal and unbreakable. Buddy was no longer just a companion. He was a living, breathing symbol of safety and loyalty. He slept on Caleb's bed at night, not at the foot, but on the adjacent pillow. His soft breaths, a comforting rhythm in the dark. During the day, they were a single unit of motion. Whether they were playing fetch in the yard or simply lying on the living room floor, Caleb reading a fantasy novel aloud while Buddy listened with a look of profound concentration. The promise Caleb had made in the forest became a quiet ritual, a mantra whispered in moments of closeness. While brushing Buddy's thick coat on the back porch, Caleb would murmur it into his fur, "You and me, Bud, always together." When they curled up to sleep at night, the last words Buddy would hear were the same, a solemn vow from a boy who now understood the terror of being alone. This promise was the invisible tether that bound them, a declaration that the universe, in all its vastness, could not separate them again. It was a child's heartfelt, absolute belief, spoken with a conviction that left no room for doubt. About 2 weeks into their layover, David and Maria sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by maps and a sea of open browser tabs on their laptops. An email had arrived that morning, an offer for a new assignment that was both exciting and challenging. "The Louisiana Bayous," Maria said, her eyes shining with creative energy. "They want a 5-part series on the ecosystem, the culture, the whole experience. It's a side of America we've never really touched on, David. The potential for stories here is incredible." David, ever the pragmatist, traced a route on the map with his finger. "It's a long haul," he noted, "and it'll be hot. July in southern Louisiana is no joke. Bertha's air conditioning is more of a suggestion than a reality." He looked out the window at the old RV, a silent acknowledgement of their vehicle's limitations. But he also saw the passion in his wife's face, and he knew their decision was already made. The Harris family was not built for standing still. Their purpose was found in motion, in discovering the next story just over the horizon. The news of a new adventure sent a ripple of excitement through the small house. The final days were a flurry of activity, packing, grocery shopping, and David's last-minute checks on Bertha's engine. The night before they were set to leave, Caleb sat with Buddy in the backyard, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance. He hugged the puppy tightly, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. "It's a new place, Buddy," he whispered, his voice full of a child's simple, unwavering faith. "But it doesn't matter where we go. You and me, always together." The next morning, as the rising sun cast a golden glow on their quiet street, the family climbed back into their home on wheels. The engine rumbled to life with a familiar roar, and with a final wave to their stationary life, they pulled away from the curb. They were headed south, toward the heat and mystery of the bayou, completely unaware that they were driving toward the very day that would shatter Caleb's promise to pieces. The drive south was a descent into a different world. The rolling hills of Missouri and Arkansas flattened into a vast green expanse under a hazy white sky. When Bertha, their faithful RV, finally rumbled across the Louisiana state line, the change was more than just geographical. It was atmospheric. The air that came through the open windows was no longer just hot. It was heavy, a tangible presence, thick with the sweet smell of decay and the drone of a million cicadas. It was like trying to breathe through a hot, wet cloth. David navigated Bertha off the main highway and onto a quieter state road, the kind that was a thin ribbon of asphalt between sprawling wetlands. They were looking for a place to start their work, a scene that captured the unique, wild beauty of the bayou. They found it at an abandoned gas station, its pumps rusted into silent monuments, its asphalt cracked and overrun with weeds. It was perfect, isolated, eerily beautiful, and a safe place to park off the road. "Okay," David said, killing the engine. "Let's do a quick scout on foot. See what the light looks like down by that cluster of cypress trees." Caleb was already reaching for Buddy's leash, but Maria stopped him. "Honey, feel that pavement. It's scorching. It would burn his little paws," she said, her voice full of concern. "Let's just be 20 minutes. We'll leave him in here with a full bowl of water and crack the back windows. He'll be much more comfortable." It felt like the most sensible, caring decision. David filled Buddy's water bowl to the brim, and Caleb gave his friend a quick hug. "We'll be right back, Bud," he promised, giving the dog's soft ears a scratch. "You be good." They left him with a chew toy on the cool linoleum floor, a loyal friend waiting patiently for his family's swift return. They had no way of knowing it was the last time they would see him there. The family walked down the shoulder of the road, the heat radiating from the asphalt in shimmering waves. David pointed out potential camera angles while Maria made notes, her writer's eye absorbing the details of the landscape. They were about a quarter mile from the RV, discussing the strange beauty of the Spanish moss hanging from the trees, when Maria suddenly stopped. "David," she said, her voice tight. She put a hand on her side. "What is it, honey?" he asked, turning to her. Her face had gone pale, a stark contrast to the flush from the heat moments before. "It's a pain," she gasped, her words strained. "A really sharp—" She never finished the sentence. A strangled cry escaped her lips, and her eyes widened in a mixture of shock and agony before she crumpled, folding in on herself as she fell to the ground. "Maria!" David yelled, rushing to her side. Caleb froze, his heart seizing with a cold electric terror he had never known. This wasn't like his fear in the woods. This was a sharp, visceral horror. Watching his mother, the anchor of their family, writhe on the ground in unspeakable pain. David knelt beside her, his photographer's hands now clumsy with panic. "What is it? Where does it hurt?" "My side." She managed to get out through clenched teeth, her body curling into a tight ball. It's tearing." Just then, a pickup truck, the first vehicle they'd seen in half an hour, slowed to a stop. A man in his 50s with a weathered face leaned out the window. "Hey, everything all right over there?" "No. My wife? She just collapsed. I think it's serious." David yelled, his voice cracking with fear. The man didn't hesitate. He put the truck in park and was out in a second. One look at Maria's ashen face, and he knew. We need to get her to a hospital. Now. The regional one in Alexandria is the best, but it's an hour's drive. Get her in. What happened next was a blur of frantic motion. Together, David and the stranger lifted Maria into the back seat of the truck. Caleb scrambled in after her, his small hands grabbing hers. She was cold and clammy despite the suffocating heat. David jumped in the front, shouting directions he barely remembered from the map. As the truck's tires spun on the gravel and sped away, their world narrowed to the confines of that small cab. The RV, their home, their assignment, their dog, their entire life on the road. All of it evaporated in the searing heat of the crisis. There was only Maria's shallow breathing, Caleb's silent tears, and the desperate, all-consuming prayer that they wouldn't be too late. The world outside ceased to exist. For David and Caleb, reality became a small, sterile universe defined by the antiseptic smell of the hospital, the relentless, rhythmic beeping of machines, and the squeak of nurses' shoes on polished linoleum floors. They lived in the vinyl chairs of the surgical waiting room, their sense of time dissolving into a blur of pale sunrises viewed through a smudged window and long, sleepless nights under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. Maria had survived, the doctors told them. An emergency surgery had removed her ruptured appendix. But a severe infection had set in, and she remained in critical condition, her life a fragile flame, flickering in the sterile wind of the ICU. David moved through the days like a ghost, his entire being focused on a single, desperate mission, willing his wife to live. He listened to doctors who spoke in a calm, clinical language he struggled to comprehend, nodding as if he understood terms like peritonitis and sepsis. He would sit by Maria's bedside during the brief visiting hours, holding her still, cool hand, whispering stories of their past adventures into the quiet of the room, hoping his voice could be a lifeline to pull her back to him. He put on a brave face for Caleb, managing to produce weak smiles and assurances that everything would be okay, even as his own heart was splintering with fear. In the deepest hours of the night, when Caleb was asleep in his uncomfortable chair and the hospital was at its quietest, another thought would surface, unbidden and sharp with guilt. Buddy. The image of the RV, sitting alone and silent under the oppressive sun, would flash in his mind. He would see Buddy's trusting eyes, remember the feel of his soft fur. A wave of nausea and self-loathing would wash over him. But then, a machine would beep down the hall or a nurse would rustle by, and the crushing reality of the present would slam back into place. One crisis at a time, he would tell himself, his jaw tight. Maria first. Maria is all that matters. The worry for Buddy was a fire he had to let smolder, because the inferno in front of him demanded all of his strength. Caleb, meanwhile, had retreated into a silent world of his own. The curious, vibrant boy who had chased butterflies in the Ozarks was gone, replaced by a pale, quiet child with shadows under his eyes. He barely spoke. His entire focus narrowed to the single, terrifying question that revolved in his mind. Is Mom going to be okay? The fear was so immense, so all-consuming, that it left no room for anything else. He didn't ask about Buddy. He didn't talk about the RV. To even think of his dog was to contemplate another loss, another potential heartbreak, and his 10-year-old heart simply did not have the capacity to face it while his mother's life hung in the balance. For 8 days, this was their existence. They ate tasteless food from the hospital cafeteria, wore the same clothes for days on end, and measured time in the incremental updates from the medical staff. She's responding to the antibiotics. Her fever is down slightly. Each small victory was a breath of air in a suffocating room. Then, on the 9th morning, the doctor, a kind man with tired eyes, entered the waiting room with a look on his face that was different. It wasn't the cautious optimism of previous days. It was one of genuine relief. "She's turned a corner," the doctor said, a real smile touching his lips. "The infection is under control. She's weak. She has a long recovery ahead of her, but she's out of the woods. She's going to be okay." The words washed over David, and the mountain of tension he had been carrying for 9 days crumbled into dust. A sound escaped his throat, a ragged sob of pure, unadulterated relief. He pulled Caleb into a fierce hug, and for the first time in over a week, the boy's shoulders shook with tears, not of fear, but of joy. As the overwhelming relief settled, the space it left in David's mind was immediately filled by the other, suppressed fear. The smoldering worry for Buddy now roared to life. Maria was safe. The thought echoed in his head, and it was followed instantly by the next. Buddy. He looked down at his son, whose tear-streaked face was now full of exhausted hope. He knelt in front of him. "Caleb," he said, his voice thick but steady. "Mom's going to be okay. So now, we can go back. We can go get Buddy." The journey back from the hospital was a long, silent hour of suspended reality. David drove the hired car with a grim focus, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. In the back seat, Maria dozed fitfully, her face still pale and gaunt, while Caleb sat pressed against the window, watching the unfamiliar Louisiana landscape slide by. A tiny, fragile seed of hope had taken root in his heart. His mom was okay. Now, they were going to get Buddy. He pictured his friend's joyful barks, the frantic wagging of his tail. The image was so clear, so real, that it felt like a certainty. When they finally turned onto the lonely stretch of highway, Caleb's heart began to pound. He saw the abandoned gas station up ahead. And there, standing like a monument to their interrupted lives, was Bertha. She was exactly as they had left her. Hope surged through Caleb, bright and painful. "He's there," he whispered, his breath fogging the glass. "He's waiting for us." David pulled the car up behind the RV and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the incessant drone of cicadas. He helped Maria, who moved slowly and carefully, into the passenger seat of the car to wait before he turned to the RV. His hand trembled slightly as he put the key in the lock. He turned the key, and before the door was fully open, Caleb darted past him and scrambled up the steps. "Buddy! We're back!" The wall of stale, suffocating heat that rolled out of the RV was the first sign that something was wrong. The second was the silence. There was no welcoming bark, no sound of claws scrambling on the floor. There was nothing. The RV was empty. Caleb stood frozen in the small living space. His hopeful call echoed in the stillness. David's heart sank like a stone. He saw the water bowl, overturned and licked bone dry. He saw the chew toy, lying forlornly in a corner. Buddy was gone. Maybe he got out? Caleb said, his voice small and trembling, desperately searching for any explanation other than the one looming in his mind. He moved toward the front of the RV, toward the driver's seat. And then he stopped. He made a small, choked sound. David walked to his side and followed his gaze. It was the windshield. Under a thick layer of dust, the glass was covered in a chaotic tapestry of small, desperate paw prints. They were everywhere, layered on top of each other, smudged from a frantic energy that had long since faded. They were the diary of a long and lonely wait, a testament to a faith that had been rewarded with nothing but silence and suffocating heat, a story of a loyal friend who had waited and waited until he couldn't wait anymore. "He was looking for us," Caleb whispered, his voice breaking. "He was right here, waiting." He reached up a trembling hand and pressed his palm flat against the warm glass, his small fingers aligning perfectly with the dusty print of a paw. It was a ghostly touch, connecting him for one last time to the friend he had lost. "I promised," he sobbed, the words torn from his throat. I promised we'd always be together. The promise, once a source of comfort and strength, now felt like a cruel, jagged piece of glass in his heart. He slid down to the floor, his small body racked with a grief so total, so absolute, that it filled every corner of the silent RV. David knelt and pulled his devastated son into his arms, his own tears blurring his vision. He wanted to say it would be okay. He wanted to promise they would find him. But he looked at his son's shattered face, thought of his recovering wife waiting in the car, and knew he couldn't make another promise that fate might break. Their resources were gone. Their emotional strength was spent. They were in a strange state, hours from anywhere they knew, with a long road to recovery ahead. They had to go home. It was the cruelest, most necessary act of his life. He gently lifted his son, who felt as limp and boneless as a rag doll, and carried him out of the empty RV, out of the tomb of his broken promise. He settled Caleb into the passenger seat and started Bertha's engine. The familiar roar sounded like a cry of mourning as he slowly, heavily pulled the RV back onto the highway. He glanced at his son. Caleb was twisted around, his face pressed against the back window. He was watching the abandoned gas station, watching the place where he had left his hero, his protector, his best friend, recede into the shimmering heat haze until it was gone forever. A child's promise is built on love and absolute faith. The story of Caleb and Buddy is a heartbreaking reminder of how even the strongest bonds can be tragically broken by a fate no one could foresee. We believe every animal's journey deserves to be told, especially the ones that end in a silent, unanswered wait. If you wish to join us in honoring these stories of love and loss, subscribe to the Brave Paws family and help us ensure their memory is never forgotten.